The Fifth Estate broke the story. An alleged war criminal from Somalia turned would-be Canadian refugee, reported by Victor Mallory.
Sir, there have been some very serious allegations made about you by people in Yabiling.
It would be a classic Fifth Estate investigation.
The Fifth Estate. Tonight, out of the suffering of Somalia, a haunting presence in Canada. They were the henchmen of a brutal dictator.
The story showed that before he tried to call Canada home, Yusuf Abdi Ali wore a different uniform. A commander in the brutal war fought by the Somali dictator and his army against their own people. And who provided support to that dictator and his henchmen in the late 1980s? None other than the United States of America. There were different times in Washington. Still the Cold War. America's nemesis, the Soviet Union, and the U.S. so determined to keep a country like Somalia away from Soviet influence, it was willing to support a military dictatorship with a blatant disregard for human rights. In fact, when the U.S. military trained the best and brightest of its allies, the chosen one from the Somali army was Yusuf Abdi Ali, proud graduate of the Pentagon's Program for Foreign Officers, class of '86. When the regime's forces moved into northern Somalia for the Civil War, the colonel took that training with him, assigned to command a region where repression of the people was worse than anywhere else. Everywhere here, reminders of the men, women, and children mowed down by government troops. Tens of thousands died. In 1992, when the Fifth Estate went to find out about the man in charge of the local army, it seemed everyone had a story about torture and gruesome killing on the colonel's watch.
2 men were caught, tied to a tree. Oil was poured on them, and they were burned alive. I saw it with my own eyes.
He caught my brother. He tied him to a military vehicle and dragged him behind. He said to us, "If you've got enough power, get him back." He shredded him into pieces. That's how he died.
They had a nickname for him, tuuke, which means crow in Somalia because of his sharp facial features. And they all seemed to know where Colonel Tuuke went.
Canada. We want him brought back here to face trial.
Canada became a safe haven for Somalis when the Civil War ended in the early 90s and thousands arrived at the Canadian border. Most were legitimate refugees. But that Fifth Estate investigation found that some who'd reportedly done the dictator's dirty work were accepted as well, including Tuuke, who claimed to be a refugee too. It might be his first attempt to escape the past, but it wouldn't be the last. When word spread of the Fifth Estate investigation, it would divide Toronto's Somali community. Many protested his presence in Canada. But others sympathetic to the colonel clearly didn't want his story told.
As far as we're concerned, you people are bringing problems for us.
She wants the interview. No.
Shut the fuck up. We don't want to interview with CBC.
So it was a big surprise when Tuuke himself agreed to an interview, talking just long enough to deny it all.
The story you have got is completely, entirely, perfectly, and absolutely partial. It's false, totally baseless. All I can say to you, I can't do that to my people. That's false, that's untrue. If I have never did anything wrong to any Somali.
But there was a man.
But what about all that eyewitness testimony we'd heard in northern Somalia?
They let him go to the court. That's false. That's false. That's all what I'm telling you.
A woman
Thank
said
you
that
very much.
you had tied.
That's when he ended the interview and walked out, likely hoping to disappear. But the Fifth Estate story was the final straw. Just days after our broadcast, Yusuf Abdi Ali, alias Colonel Tuuke, was deported to the U.S., sent back to the country that had trained him in the first place. And that's when the American media picked up the story.
As we've seen recently, the nightmare that is Somalia will not go away. As Bob McEwen found, this man accused of mass torture...
In 1992, I was working for CBS When my former Fifth Estate colleagues told me about Tuuke, we went looking for him south of the border.
Mr. Tuuke, nice to see you. My name is Bob McEwen. I'm with CBS News. I wonder if we could have a word with you. We'd like to talk to you about what you did during your military career in Somalia.
He was still trying to stay under the radar, once more a security guard, now at an apartment complex outside Washington, D.C.
I'm afraid you're going to have to leave. They don't allow any filming here. Well, I don't know what your situation is.
We'd like to talk to Mr. Tuuke about what he is alleged to have done during his career in Somalia.
Okay, well, I don't know what his alleged...
He's alleged to have participated in the execution of more than 100 men. Torture, maiming, murder.
So by the mid-1990s, the man known as Colonel Tuuke had been exposed by major networks in Canada and the US. His story reported worldwide. When we last saw him, he was leaving in a golf cart. He apparently never returned to that job near Washington. That was more than 2 decades ago. We now know that he left the US for a while, then quietly returned. Married to an American, he got permanent residency. But at the Fifth Estate, as the years passed, it seemed the colonel might finally have managed to disappear. At least it did, until a few months ago. It was about a quarter century after we last laid eyes on him that we learned about a landmark lawsuit in the United States. And at the very heart of it, reportedly still living in the US, Yusuf Abdi Ali, Colonel Tuuke.
Joe, Lindsay, let's talk Ali case a bit.
Tara Lee is a former U.S. naval officer turned human rights lawyer.
Check that case, the Kiobel case too.
Along with the Center for Justice and Accountability, Lee is suing Tuuke for war crimes in Somalia, specifically for what he's said to have done to this man, named Farhan Warfa. He's middle-aged now, but in the Civil War he was in his 20s. Like all the other males in his village, he says, a target for interrogation by the colonel.
He was in the room directing the questioning while he was tortured and violently beaten. And at the conclusion of the torture and beating, he shot him 5 times at point-blank range while he was chained and restrained.
Incredibly, Farhan Warfa survived. He's now seeking justice in a U.S. court from the man he says pulled the trigger in Somalia.
He absolutely and emphatically...
Attorney Joseph Peter Drennan represents Yusuf Abdi Ali. He rejects those charges of murder and torture, describing Ali's life as blameless.
Mr. Ali is an ordinary individual who lives here in Northern Virginia with a family and hasn't so much as gotten a parking ticket since he's gotten here.
So this is Gabila?
Yes, this is Gabila.
So we went back to Muhammad Urdo, the Somali journalist who in 1992 was researcher and translator in Somalia for both the CBC and CBS.
Is this Yusuf Tuuke? Is this the man you know as Tuuke? Is that Tuuke?
Oh, that's definitely he's the man. He's the man.
Watching our original coverage now, he's convinced the tragic eyewitness accounts he heard and translated then still ring true today. Did they sound like they were telling the truth?
Oh, they were telling the truth. And actually, they have shown the wounds, so they were telling the truth.
Yeah, no doubt in your mind.
No doubt whatsoever.
As for Yusuf Abdi Ali, Colonel Tuuke, these recent photos show him near his home, still living and working in the U.S., still in security near Washington. He's 2 decades older than when we last met, and still unwilling to talk about what he did during the war. He is now awaiting a crucial ruling on whether an American court is the proper place for something that allegedly happened so long ago and far away.
There will be nothing that acknowledges what happened to these people and what happened.
Opposing attorney Tara Lee says if the court allows her lawsuit against Tuuke to proceed, it may finally mean justice for Farhan Warfa and other Somali survivors of that almost forgotten war.
The story that he's telling is about what happened to every male in his village on one morning. And he has this incredibly compelling story, but he also has a sense that if he doesn't tell it, there won't be anyone left who will.
So despite all his attempts to disappear, for decades, Colonel Tuuke soon may find himself the public face of an historic decision to deny war criminals safe haven in the U.S. The ruling is expected any day.